Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching. Returning home, Jacob thought about how he was like Lucy Caesar. She had 10 things to do at once, too. Jacob was so busy that it was hard to feel like a child with all his problems and worries. But Jacob realized that these were the circumstances of life, and he just had to bravely accept and overcome them. And his dad is not to blame for anything. His dad is not to blame for anything, and he loves his daddy. They were alone against the world. Jacob stopped to watch the sparrows swim in the puddle. It was the end of October, but today the sun was warm, as if September had lengthened, stretched out like caramel candy. It was so warm that Jacob took off his hat and scarf. He was going to put them on later when he got to the house, or else his dad would scold him for catching a cold, and he had a weak immune system. Fifth grader snorted to himself. What kind of weak immune system is that if he can stand his dad's sports practices that would make an adult beg for mercy? No, he's strong. It's just that Daddy's too worried about him. I can understand him, though. What they were running away from, it's a wonder they both didn't go crazy. The sparrows fluttered their wings in the puddle, their paws scratching. Jacob put his hand into the pocket of his warm jacket and rustled a bill. He'd had his own pocket money for 3 years now, and he knew how to use it wisely, so he didn't need to be tempted by the buns with fudge, which he knew for sure were in that bakery, where he could smell the hot aroma of muffins. Swallowing, the boy decided that his willpower would be stronger than his impulsiveness and walked towards the house. Their apartment was a corner one, on the 2nd floor. It wasn't a bad apartment, by the way. Jacob had honestly called it a shithole when he'd first seen it. It just came out. It was a good thing the woman who rented it to them didn't realize what he'd said, because he'd said it out of habit in English. Jacob sighed. I wish I were in Rome right now. But Jacob didn't feel guilty for nagging at the apartment. He was just used to the elegant, stylish surroundings his mother had created in their former home. Jacob walked into the entryway, up to the 2nd floor. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't immediately notice the big, dark lump in front of their apartment door. And then when he did, he was startled. His eyes rounded and bounced away, and realized that there was a man lying in front of him, an elderly woman. Could she be dead? Her eyes were closed, her mouth open. Jacob couldn't call or knock on his own door without hurting her, so he pulled out his cell phone and dialed his father. Dad, I'm home. Can you please open the door? Only there's a man lying by the door. No, not a bum. It's some woman. Okay. I got it. I'm out of here. He stepped back. The locks clicked open. The door was ajar, but there was a body downstairs. It's Julianne, said Dad, who looked out of the apartment. Our neighbor, he explained, and leaned down. We need to call an ambulance. And then the woman moved. Julianne? What's wrong? Heart? Blood pressure? Jacob's father gently picked up the neighbor, keeping her from falling. Jacob, call the neighbors. She lives in that apartment over there. Aha! The boy squeaked and rang the bell. There was no answer. There was silence behind the door. He went back to his father, who was standing next to a woman who was already on her feet. Jacob's father frowned. He couldn't. Or could he? He swore quietly through his teeth. But he did what he thought was right, which was to walk the neighbor into his apartment. He sat her down on a stool in the hallway. Jacob, water. The boy nodded and ran to the kitchen, fetching a glass of clean water from the cooler and handing it to the woman, who sat staring blankly as she was seated. What's wrong with her? He turned to his father. I'm just calling an ambulance. Let them handle it. Julianne, he snapped his fingers in front of her face, and she finally reacted, blinking her eyes a lot. What's your pain? What should I tell thee her? Nothing. The woman's voice was somehow colorless, lifeless, resigned. I don't need an ambulance. Take me directly to the cemetery. I'll lie down with my daughter. She buried her daughter yesterday, Jacob said. You weren't home. You went to fix the phone, and I saw the coffin being taken out into the yard. I'm sorry for your loss, Alexander said. How are you feeling? You lost consciousness, it seems. Maybe a doctor, the woman shrugged. Jacob looked at his father, confused. What are we going to do? He realized that the ambulance wouldn't come if the man wasn't complaining. But the woman had just fainted. Wasn't that a cause for concern? Please accept the call, he said, dialing the right number. My neighbor fainted. Now she has regained consciousness, but there may be signs of a stroke. That's all, Alexander told his son. The doctors will sort it out now. Julianne bowed her head, covered her face with her palms, and cried bitterly again. She didn't care about her own health at all. She wanted only one thing now, that the pain gnawing at her soul, tearing her heart to pieces, would go away, and that everything that had happened would turn out to be a nightmare. That her daughter, Anna, would be alive. She had left when she was 24 years old, very young. Her heart failed. The heart, as the doctor said, stopped instantly. It's like a button was turned off in a person and he stopped living. Just like that. Just like that. Just like that. That's how scary it is. Her Anna, the good, pure, bright girl, trusted the beast, the subhuman, and that's what ruined her. Julianne knew it like the sun in the sky by day and the moon at night. She raised her daughter alone, raised her blood child, and it seemed there was no greater happiness in the world than what they had. Juliana and Anna lived in a small, modernized village where almost no one kept cattle anymore. And it was not a bad village, in the sense that there was work for the locals at the milk processing plant. Julianne decided not to marry again after the birth of her daughter, and never even brought a man into her house, because after losing her beloved Mickey in an accident, she didn't need anyone else. All other men were just disgusting. Julianne had always thought that this attitude toward the male sex was the fault of the terrible thing that had happened to her before she'd met Oliver. He was the only one who could take away the pain, the shame, and make her believe that there was good in the world. Not a day had passed since his death that Julianne hadn't thought about how well they could live together as a family. She, Anna, and Mickey. But it was as if the evil fate had decided that enough of peace and love was enough for you, Julianne. It was time for you to realize that your black streak was just beginning. Julianne had no idea how to go on living when she buried her Mickey, but then came the will to live, and such a will to live that she grasped it with her teeth and was ready to do anything, because Julianne realized that she was pregnant. And when the newborn Anna first took in her arms, so the second breath opened. When Anna turned 18, it was decided that she would not go far away from home and will enter a technical school in the district center. That is, she will be able to be home every day. Anna grew up as Juliana wanted her daughter to be. Smart, excellent, beautiful, modest. She was quite different from her peers, and in this Juliana saw the key to a happy future for her daughter. There was only one problem. Julianne thought her heart would burst when Anna first told her that she liked a boy. Fool! She shouted at her daughter, who looked at her mother in horror and pressed her palm to her face, which was burning with pain from the slap. Men have only one thing in mind. They all want to use young girls. I will not let you ruin your life, do you hear? I won't let you. After that, Anna finished the last grade of school without any nonsense. And in the technical school, as reported faithfully to her mother, did not socialize with anyone beyond the necessary and did not allow themselves unnecessary, all sorts of like her promiscuous classmates. After technical school, there was a question of employment. Anna got a job in the accounting department of the only shopping center there, in the district center there, and the district center. However, it was called only a shopping center, and in fact more like a large indoor market. And then trouble came to the house. Or rather, At that time, it seemed to Juliana the biggest trouble of all. Her Anna fell in love. Too late, Julianne noticed that her daughter was walking very cheerfully, that her cheeks were blushing, and her eyes were dreamily shining. And when finally summoned to a serious conversation, she cried and confessed that yes, she loves. There is a man. We met in the district center, where he also worked. His name was Steve, and he, it turns out, came here on trade business, and so lived in the city. Anna hurriedly explained to her mother that they were serious, that he'd asked her to marry him. "I'll give you marriage." Her mother swung at her with a rubber hose, which he was going to use to water the flowers. Anna shrank into a lump and said that they were really serious. That Steve was a responsible man, and as soon as he realized that she was clean and untouched, he said that he needed such a wife. "What are you?" Julianne's hands dropped. "You fell for him. We had. Everything was," the girl whispered. Julianne sank to the floor as if the puppeteer had cut all the strings from her puppet. She thought about the fact that now only marriage was the right thing to do. Because if Anna had agreed to lie with a man without marriage, then she could go down a very crooked path, and this way, at least there would be a serious man around. This Steve, at least he would look after her. Soon Juliana met her future son-in-law, and they had a serious, detailed conversation. Steve said that he has his own small business selling building materials. He assured the future mother-in-law that he sees in Anna a woman of rare moral and mental qualities, that he is determined to create a strong family, talking about love, disgust, and material issues. It turned out that in the city, Steve has an apartment 3, all his, well, should be his as soon as he pays the mortgage. And then Steve suggested that what if they sold Julianne and Anna's farmhouse and used the proceeds to close the mortgage? Julianne said she had to think about such a serious matter, but on the same day, they decided to sell it. After all, it was not only reasonable, but it also came out that she, Julianne, would live with her daughter and her husband. What could be better? She would look after the young family, and then as the grandchildren would come. In general, Julianne almost cried tears of joy. It turns out that there are still decent men in the world. The wedding was modest. Why throw money into the wind? We sold the house quickly, moved into a city apartment, and then somehow everything began to change. It turned out that Steve's business was so bad, that is, it was not profitable, especially he was even forced to take loans for it, which were already overdue. It also turned out that Steve drank sometimes, at first only on weekends. Then he started to drink on weekdays, and his mother-in-law suddenly became not nice to him. He grumbled that he'd brought poverty on his neck from the countryside. What could Julianne say? She kept silent, because she understood men. They are all like that. There are no perfect ones, but you can't ruin a family. In general, sometimes even Julianne thought that she was lucky that Oliver died so early. If they had been a family, he would have changed with time too. And so, he remained on her heart as a bright image of the best man in the world. After a year of marriage, Julianne asked her daughter when the children will be, and she answered that Steve was not ready for them yet. And then everything turned out to be very bad. Steve took out another loan somewhere, and Anna was forced to sign the papers, and that was it. He started drinking even more, cussed all the time. He didn't like the fact that his mother-in-law was rustling around the house, that she was breathing at all. He often began to say that he got little money from this marriage, that he cheaped out by losing his freedom. "You dare not leave my daughter," Julianne once said to him and waved her little fist in front of his flushed face. "Shut up, you old fool," Steve shouted. "In front of who? That in your village you lived like two hermits, that you sit here and don't show your nose. Who are you going to complain to? The neighbors don't even know your name. Get out." And he pushed the woman in the shoulder so that she fell down. Anna wasn't home at the time. She was at work. By the way, she gave her salary to her husband. Juliana also worked as a cleaner and got a job because she had no profession and she was afraid to go to a sales clerk or somewhere else where there was material responsibility. It seemed that she would foolishly make trouble, so we lived quietly. And then Anna died. It happened on the same day. My daughter was just standing in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, and suddenly she screamed, grabbed her heart, and fell. Doctors said that it was impossible to save her. The time from the moment when they informed about the death of her child to the funeral passed for Juliana like in a fog. A stupefaction of purple and black. Tears were pouring out in rivers. She hardly felt that they were holding her hands to help her to go to the cemetery. There were some people in the house. Anna's acquaintances from work, some other relatives of Steve, whom Juliana did not want to know. Juliana began to feel as if she was coming to her senses when they returned from the funeral. She was sitting in her room, holding the box where she kept Anna's baby things, her onesie, her patched bunny, her first-grade diary, and other memorabilia. Then her son-in-law came into the room without knocking and said they needed to talk. And when he had said all this, Juliana looked up at him with reddened eyes and thought he was joking so wickedly. He couldn't really be saying that she must go away. While I had a wife, I put up with you, he muttered through crooked teeth yellowed by nicotine. And now why do I need a strange aunt at home? Go back to your village. Material things. That was the last thing I wanted to think about right now. But Juliana asked her son-in-law, barely able to loosen her lips, where was she to go? She had nothing left in the village. Let's go to your relatives, he muttered. They don't need me. We're all ready. I don't care. But you won't live here now. That's it. Where's your stuff, huh? Yeah, here. He opened a desk drawer, pulled it open and shook its contents out onto the floor. Then he went into the pencil cupboard and started throwing stuff out. Pack it up. And when I come back. Juliana didn't move as the two doors of the room in the apartment slammed shut behind him. She sat as if in a stupor, just replaying the scene of her daughter dying before her eyes going out. Then Steve came back. Outside the window it was already day changing to evening. Are you still here? Roughly, painfully, he yanked the woman by the arm and dragged her into the hallway. What did I tell you? You old fool. Well, if you don't want to do it nicely, then go as you are, in what you have. He threw her out onto the landing and slammed the door shut. Juliana stood staring at the door. Then she turned around and shuffling, swaying, wandered down the landing. How cold it was. It was autumn, October. But for some reason, the woman felt so cold, as if it was already December and not a single radiator was working in the house. Juliana reached the opposite wall of the stairwell and turned around. What to do now? It was a logical question. Only the thoughts were rushing in her mind, lazily, heavy, as if each of them was tied with iron chains and thrown into a viscous swamp. And then suddenly it became cloudy and nauseous, and Juliana began to sink down. The thought pierced her consciousness. Is it really the end? Would she close her eyes now, dive into the darkness, and when she opened them, she would see her child? Where's the ambulance, Dad? Jacob asked. They'll be here soon, Alexander answered and sighed. It wasn't that he didn't like surprises. He'd gotten used to them long ago. It was just that lately he was ashamed to admit to himself, but he was beginning to get used to a certain measuredness in his life. Home, taking care of his son, who went to the gymnasium, by the way, the best, elite, and on weekends going to the movies, parks, just walks around the city, in general, the most ordinary life. However, Alexander thought the appearance of this woman, a neighbor so a drop in the ocean, now he would get rid of this little problem, and everything would return to normal. However, Alexander added mentally, the norm for him and his son is still illusory and unstable, and you can't get used to what seems normal because they have a past. And one day, when things get better, when the danger is gone, they'll come back. In the meantime, you just have to get through each day and you can't relax. His son needs his care. Jacob is too young. It's not his fault. He deserves to have a normal childhood. Finally, there was a knock on the door. Hello. Did you call? What's wrong? We called, Alexander answered. A neighbor fainted at our door. The doctor shook her head, approached Julianne, and started asking the standard question. Well, pack up, let's go. We need to check what's wrong with you. Yes, and I have my suspicions that it's a stroke, the doctor said. We need to get ready to go to the hospital. Well, does she have someone at home? Or what? What happened? I knocked. Jacob got in the middle of the conversation, but no one answered. She buried her daughter today. Her son-in-law's home, but he won't open the door. Wow, that's a lot, sighed the doctor. Woman, can you hear me? Get up slowly, please. You can't do that. Well, hold on. After about 10 minutes, Julianne was able to get out of the apartment. Wait. What about my passport? Woman passport policy? Do you still have your papers at home? We'll try to contact her. Relatives, Alexander said uncertainly, so that they would transfer the documents and necessary things to the hospital. Wonderful, smiled the doctor. Do it, please. Poor woman. When the ambulance left, Jacob and Alexander returned to the house. They knocked at Julianne's apartment, but there was no answer. Dad, you know, the boy said as he and his father set about making dinner. I feel kind of awkward. About what? Well, we've been living here for 2 months and we didn't go to the neighbors for the funeral. They're not our relatives or friends. It's just neighborly, to show respect and sympathy. That's not the way the world works, my dear. I know, Jacob said with a sigh, pouting, but helping diligently as he poured the cauliflower into the saucepan. Daddy was a very good vegetable cook. But Jacob would have loved to eat pizza. But the pizza was on Sunday, that is, yesterday, which meant that the next time he could get it would be on the weekend. Do you think she'll be all right? Jacob asked. Julianne, I don't know, Alexander replied, but I understand that you sympathize with her. You know, he looked at his son carefully over his glasses. You can be too kind. Let's just think that all this is just part of the ordinary, our very ordinary new life. It's not forever. Things will change soon. We have to believe that, okay? Okay? We just meet a problem or something that bothers us, process the emotions, do what we can and move on. Right? Right, the boy replied. And then the evening continued with conversations on very different topics. The next morning, when his son went to school, Alexander again made an attempt to get through to the inhabitants of the neighboring apartment. What do you want? A man who finally opened the door asked him. The occupant of the apartment looked so that it was clear that he had not opened the door because he was sleeping the sleep of a drunkard. Your mother-in-law in the hospital, Alexander said. What's that got to do with me? And then Steve hiccuped and scratched his belly, covered in a dirty t-shirt. My wife is dead, so she's not my mother-in-law anymore. And she doesn't live here anymore. I need to get her papers and personal belongings, Alexander said after a short pause. He spoke without emotion, and that, strangely enough, was beginning to annoy Steve. You won't get anything, he spat out. Get out of here. I couldn't close the door from the side of the platform. The neighbor held the door, and literally with one hand, while Steve, swearing, pulled it as hard as he could. Do you know what you can get for holding someone else's documents? The neighbor asked. I just want Julianne's papers and her personal belongings. How hard can it be? You just give them to me. All right, Steve repeated and slammed his eyes shut as if he was asleep. He met his neighbor's eyes for only a second, but it was enough to send shivers down his spine and to start hammering in his head the thought that it was really worth giving the old woman's documents and things. Steve disappeared into the depths of the apartment, where he tripped several times over the mess he had created, but soon returned with a pile of things and shoved them all into the arms of his neighbor, who finally let go of the door. Thank you, said the bespectacled guy who Steve didn't like at all, even to the point of creepiness, and left. Steve stood there swaying from his drunkenness and hiccuping. Why did he listen to that guy? It was like he was hypnotized. Though, of course, it was nonsense. Thinking like that and scratching his stomach again, Steve went to the kitchen to finish his white drink, to remember his wife, and to celebrate the fact that he had so cleverly got rid of the old woman, that naive fool who had sold her house for him. "Daddy, I'm coming with you." Jacob jumped up and down. "No way. Sit down and study." "But I want to." He was busy putting on his tie, and he wasn't used to leaving the house looking disheveled. "Do your classmates have that effect on you?" "How?" "They make you capricious." "Or you?" Alexander jokingly tapped his son's nose with his finger. "Just acting like an ordinary boy of your age. Okay, you can come with me, but then you can do your math homework by yourself. No hints. Deal. Can we buy oranges?" "Why?" "Sick people get oranges in a net. I've seen them in movies. I guess I should control what you watch better." "No, I don't think this woman is starving in the hospital. We'll just take her passport and her thing." "Dad, what else? What else?" "There are only a sweater and a skirt, a sweater, an apron, a slipper and shoes. I think she needs—" Alexander rolled his eyes. His son was getting on his nerves. However, there was some truth in his words. He really wasn't obliged to help his neighbor at all. He had already helped not to leave her lying there, called an ambulance, and also took her documents, So everything else. All, as the foster mother used to say, you can't overcook it, you can't save it. Still, when Alexander and his son arrived at the city hospital, they were laden with things. "Juliana's papers," Alexander said, handing a plastic folder with them to the head doctor, who very fortunately met in the corridor. "And here's some more. Needed stuff, this. Can I give it to the nurse to give to Juliana?" "Of course," Barry nodded. "Lucy," he waved his hand at the young nurse, and she immediately ran up looking excited, sensitive, and ready to do everything. In general, it was obvious that the person was new and worked here for nothing. She was handed a bag with things, slippers, a couple of bathrobes, a few nighties, towels, toothpaste, and other things. All this was bought in the shopping center. "Sure, I'll take it all," Lucy said. "We can visit her now, by the way." "No, we're already leaving," Alexander started, but his son pulled him by the arm and looked pleadingly. "Just a minute, Dad." "Well, all right," sighed the man. Juliana Vasilievna was already better, sharing with them the news about the patient Lucy's condition as they walked through the hospital corridors. "She's eating well, her blood pressure is normal. It's great that you brought her things. It's not good to be without everything. It's great when a person of her age has a caring family." "We're not her family," Alexander said. "Oh," the girl said, embarrassed, and gave him a curious look. She thought that this fair-haired, intelligent, and even aristocratic-looking man was her son-in-law, and the boy was her grandson. "We are her neighbors," Jacob answered for his father. "Can you imagine? I'm coming from school, and she's lying in the stairwell. Her son-in-law kicked her out. Her daughter died." Lucy listened and shook her head. Poor woman. It was lucky that the neighbor was not indifferent to other people's misfortune. Lucy also noticed that he didn't have a wedding ring. Not that she looked at all the visitors in the hospital, but this one was an exceptional case. So he was either in a common-law marriage or a single father. The last option made Lucy's heart twin and made her think that such an attractive man would not stay alone for a long time. He just should not stay alone for a long time. Lucy grew up in a large family, studied to be a nurse, and now she worked in a hospital. But she dreamed of becoming a doctor, but this year she failed the entrance exam, but still decided to be close to the profession. Julianne, a girl with a smile, entered the room. "You have visitors." She wasn't expecting anyone. She had been indifferent to everything since she had been brought here. They were treating her, telling her to take some medicine. All right, so be it. But no one can make her love life again. No one can ease the pain on her soul. But despite all this, when Juliana saw who came to her, a smile flashed across her face. She was confused by her own feelings, for they were strangers to her. But why did it feel so good when she saw Alexander and his son with green eyes? Almost the same green eyes for some reason she thought that her Anna had. The neighbor asked her how she felt. She said she was better. He said he had brought her papers and some things. And judging from the fact that he didn't say anything about Steve, she realized that he must have. Well, he had become a stranger. He was right. With Anna gone, they were no longer family at all. And where would she go back to when she got better? Oh, I shouldn't have thought of that. Not now. At some point, Julianne got a sore throat and asked for a glass of water from the nightstand. Yes, here you go. Alexander handed her a glass. Julianne took it, and her gaze caught on his ring for some reason. The man wore a large, unusual ring with a gold band braiding a large purple stone. Something in this jewelry seemed familiar to her, as if somewhere in the depths of memory dusted off an old, decades unlocked box, but not yet opened it and could not understand. And what is the truth here? What is the answer to the disturbing, incomprehensible feeling? Jacob wished her well, smiling ear to ear, and then he and her father left. Julianne smiled at what a nice boy he was growing up to be. He said hello to everyone in the room, and even helped the old man in the next bed to guess a few answers to the crossword puzzle. And surprisingly, he spoke as if he were very, very educated, almost university-like, as if he were a little scholar. Yes. Juliana sighed. She could see that Alexander was a very good man, since he had brought up such a clever boy. Then it was time for dinner at the hospital. And Julianne did not refuse to swallow a few spoonfuls of mashed potatoes and eat a piece of fish. And she also drank tea. Then she said she would like to rest. Yes, of course, rest, Lucy smiled. I'll help you sort out your things, do you mind? Julianne didn't mind at all. She was very tired, and as soon as she closed her eyes, she dozed off. Lucy began to take things out of the bag. The slippers were soft, but the anti-stress pillow, in the form of a funny red cat, surely the man's son had added some of his own. She pulled out a pair of cream-colored pajamas with pink silk embroidery and took out a small pair of scissors from her pocket to cut off the tag so that Julianne would have something to change into when she woke up. And as it happened, Lucy's eyes fell on the price tag. She rounded her eyes, and it so happened that her hands reached for other things. Here was the softest towel. Here was the softest towel. Here was a warm robe. Yes, it looks like everything here was bought in an expensive boutique. Honey, adjust the pillow, please, called her grandfather lying on the next bed. Yes, of course, right away. The nurse fussed. Then she finished sorting out the things brought by the visitors, all neatly, as it should be, folded and laid out, tags thrown away, and then, returning to the restroom to a well-deserved little rest with a cup of tea, thought, it is, of course, very unusual when a neighbor, almost a stranger, as he said himself, buys an ordinary woman things for several $1,000s. It turns out this Alexander, not an ordinary man at all. And from this he seemed to Lucy even more mysterious and interesting. Julianne had once had the gift of dreamless sleep, when you just touch your head to the pillow and soon fall into a blessed silence where there are no colors, no sounds, and most importantly, your own thoughts. Once after such nights, she got up full of strength, willingness to fight for a good life for her beloved daughter. But now, she was dreaming again. And they were not just dreams, let's say, which in the morning could be said, say, that such a thing will happen, and not even nightmares from which you wake up in a cold sweat and immediately sigh with relief. Say, these are just dreams. No, these dreams threw helpless Juliana straight into the past. She was a young girl then, a naive fool who thought that conquering the big city was just the thing for her. And even at first it seemed that everything was going great, because they accepted distant relatives, allocated a room, and even sat at their table. So Julianochka entered the university and her first job in her life. Student life, by the way, was not as the girl imagined it. She saw it as endless pairs, days and almost nights in the library over smart books. She imagined how she would bravely discuss with teachers in front of the whole audience, and everyone would be surprised at what a smart girl came to them. But it turned out differently. It turned out that her classmates somehow did not care that she was an excellent student, and the fact that she came from the village, so many found it funny. It turned out that some students, who seemed to Juliana to be round fools, got excellent marks. She realized how it was for money, for the bribes that some teachers took. It was shocking. "Where did you come from?" one of the girls grinned. "You were brought up in the 30s, honestly." "What's wrong with a decent upbringing?" Julianne raised her chin indignantly and proudly. "Nothing," Angelica shrugged her shoulders. "But it will be hard to live. This world is too good, you know. Quickly catches on a tooth." Angelique was one of those fashionable rich girls, but strangely enough, she patronized the new girl from the village. They really became friends. Summer vacation came. Angelica, having learned that Juliana's birthday was coming up, said that she had 2 tickets to the sea. "You see, the girl I wanted to go with, she's sick. She can't. It's not a waste. Come with me. Beach, sea, exotic. At least you'll see the world." "Oh, that would be great. Then you apply for a passport, and as soon as you do, we'll fly." "But I can't," Julianne immediately realized. "I don't have the money. There is still a hotel to rent, all sorts of things to buy up. But that won't be a problem." Angelica grinned. "You can stay with my friend. She is a very nice, hospitable person. We will not live in a hotel, but in a villa like millionaires. Can you imagine? And about expenses? Well, consider that I'm like you on your birthday envelope with mini gift. So there will be funds for a swimsuit and a cocktail." She winked. "Go for it. You're so beautiful. It's no good sulking in the city in the summer." Julianne was very excited and agreed. True, the relatives where she lived took this idea skeptically, say, silly sum on the sea to travel when all so poor seemed to be. They didn't want to hear about the fact that Juliana had a generous friend. "You've got a man," the landlord grinned wryly. "What? I would never do that," Julianne replied indignantly. Her morals were indeed high. In her 19 years, she had never even been kissed. She believed that anything like that was only possible with love and after marriage. To her parents about the upcoming vacation, girl told nothing about the upcoming vacation because they had a bad relationship. Juliana even called them rarely. She did not like that her parents drink all the time, and so Juliana found herself at the sea. They flew to Greece. The girl was delighted with the monuments of architecture, local cuisine. Everything seemed magical to her. Angelica's friend turned out to be really hospitable, and her 2 nieces lived in the villa. The only thing that confused Juliana was the men. Different men often came to visit. The mistress of the house would set the table and wine. So Julianne hated alcohol poured out in rivers. She never participated in these gatherings. She went to her room or went for a walk. Then, one day, Angelique invited her to a party on a yacht. "No, I'm not going." "Oh, come on. Do you know that you're already considered crazy?" As if jokingly reproached her friend. "You're walking around like a lonely beach. What are you afraid of? You're with me. We'll ride along the shore and go home." And one evening, when the sky was like a blue velvet, embroidered with silver and diamonds, Julianne stepped aboard the yacht. When the yacht returned to port more than a day later, Julianne was a different person. She cried her eyes out. She had torn her voice out. She wrapped herself in the sweater that the man had given her later when she was released. Angelica wailed that she knew nothing, that she thought Julianne had decided to be alone with the owner of the yacht. And she also urged Julianne very strongly that she should not, under no circumstances, go to the police, because this man has very big connections. And then it would be such an embarrassment, a nightmare. The local newspapers would write about her. She wouldn't be allowed out of the country because the proceedings would start, because such accusations are not a joke. Julianne was very hurt, scared, and ashamed. She began to think that it was really her own fault. After all, no one dragged her to the yacht by force. She went on board herself, as if in a dream now. Julianne just packed her things, and when the date of the return flight came, which was literally the next day, she returned home. Angelica said that she had to stay a little longer in Greece. Juliana felt that the relatives she was staying with and all the people around her knew what had happened to her. Knew what had happened to her, knew what a disgraced, dirty, spoiled girl she was. Now she walked as if in a fog, was silent. And then Juliana realized that she was pregnant. She rushed to the doctor, begged, threatened, begged again, but the doctor only spread her hands. They say all the terms are out, my dear. Now only to give birth. And almost immediately after that came the news that her parents died, poisoned by counterfeit alcohol. The relatives she lived with at first wrote off the girl's strange behavior on the fact that she lost her parents. They did not quarrel when they learned that Juliana did not return to the university. What is there to study when the girl was orphaned? A little more time passed and Juliana could not hide the fact that she was pregnant. Now the relatives changed their mood and began to swear at her, saying that they were kind enough to accept, but they would not pull a single mother, and that she should go to the child's father. He has no father, Julianne replied grimly. It was too late to get rid of him, so I left him. I hate him. Damn him. The relatives were somewhat shocked by the anger with which Julianne spoke about the unborn tiny creature. They immediately gathered a family council and decided that it was inhuman to send the girl back to the village when she was in this situation. Julianne said she would give up the baby, and she kept her promise. And the doctor at the hospital where she gave birth said afterwards that in all his practice he had never seen such a nightmare that a mother could speak so hatefully of her child. You have a boy. The nurse started timidly and faltered under the heavy gaze of the young mother. Give him to me, she hissed. I'll have him. The neighbors on the ward, other mothers, did not talk to Julianne. They generally thought she was crazy. She was crying, cursing, whispering something quietly. Are you sure of your decision? Sighing, the head doctor asked. Understand, this will change everything. You will never see your son again. Julianne sat in his office. Her back was straight. Her teeth were clenched. There was not a speck of blood in her face. I've made my decision. The doctor, sighing again, scribbled down the necessary paperwork. The boy is completely healthy, a strong, wonderful child. Julianne didn't tell anyone at the hospital her reasons for giving up her son. She said she didn't need him. She hated him, and that's it. And people, that doctors, that neighbors on the ward, did not ask tactfully. Why so? That is, they asked, but no one made the most terrible and correct assumption. But Juliana felt they were guessing, and that made her feel even more sick. You know, she said suddenly, and rustled in her purse, and then laid a shiny thing on the doctor's desk. Here, I don't know. I realize it's just a baby. I don't have any money. He averted his eyes, and for the first time her voice trembled. Maybe. It will help somehow. Take better care of it. The doctor stared in amazement at the gold pendant on the chain. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry, and clearly not cheap. Take it away. The boy will be taken care of without it. Take it away, he told the young mother sternly. But Julianne did not reach for the gold. Good. Then throw it in the trash. I don't want it. Where to sign? She nervously, but carefully, signed in the right places. Can I go now? She asked, and when the doctor nodded, she stood up and went to the door. Wait, he called out to her. Take it back, you forgot. He held out the pendant to her. I didn't forget, Julianne said without turning around. What did you give it to her anyway? The doctor asked. I don't know. She shrugged. It's my father gave it to me. Throw it away if you don't need it. The doctor was left sitting in a state of confusion, although he had seen all sorts of things. He carefully put the gold pendant in his pocket and thought, not to keep it for himself, but to send it to the trash. Perhaps there is a real gemstone here. And then he made a decision. The pendant with the story of how it came to be with the baby moved together with the little rejected child into the hands of the principal of the orphanage. Her name was Julia, and she had only recently assumed the position. And though she'd been warned that such sensitivity would do no good, Julia's heart ached for each of her charges. You know, she said. It's unusual, of course. I've seen kids come in here with a toy. But jewelry, I'm thinking of saving a piece for him. Now I have connections with several families where I just dream of a nice, strong boy. I think this boy will not go to an orphanage. He will learn and walk, and talk in the family already. In general, I will arrange his fate, so I will give his new mom and dad this thing. Let him, whoever his mom is, but there will be something left. But they might not want to tell him he's adopted, right? Well, Julia smiled. The people I have in mind as the best parents, they just think it's better to raise a child in the truth. Okay, sighed the head doctor. The main thing is that he was not alone. Barely born, and already he's been through such trials. Imagine the mother did not even choose a name. So we'll pick one. No way, waved his hands at the chief physician. Why not? Just no experience in this. All the time nonsense, offer. What do you mean? My wife gave birth recently, he grinned. I suggested naming the son Alexander, like Alexander the Great, but it turned out to be Billy. And it turned out to be Billy, in honor of my wife's great-grandfather. That's good too. So he'll be Alexander, Julia smiled. Why? It's a very good name. And may his fate be extraordinary, bright. Finally, Julianne left the hospital and returned to the village. She chose for herself that she will continue to live simply. As it happens, she began to live slowly in the village. She had little contact with neighbors, and when she was not at work, she stayed at home all the time and slowly tended to the vegetable garden. So passed almost 10 years, and then happened what Juliana thought she had no right to simply after everything that had happened to her. Love came into her life. His name was Oliver, and he was new to the village. He bought a big house on the outskirts and started working as a tractor driver in the neighboring village, where there was a large farm growing all kinds of vegetables. Oliver said that in time he would renovate the house and buy more land and become a farmer too. Mickey had big plans, and he was big himself. He was a big man. He was also kind, with humor. A wonderful guy. Julianne at first was categorically against his advances. She literally ran away from him for the amusement of the whole village. But Oliver was as stubborn as he was kind. He said it was love at first sight, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Julianne. No, you can't love me, she told him one day. Why not? Oliver asked. And then she burst into tears and explained everything to him. She told him what had happened to her. But Julianne didn't tell him that her unhappiness had consequences in the form of a pregnancy and a rejected son. She dared to tell only half the truth, afraid that Oliver wouldn't love her if he found out. He listened carefully and then said that her past didn't matter to him, that only the present and the future mattered to him. And then Julianne allowed herself to love. She believed that happiness was possible for her. But then Oliver died. Julianne woke up before dawn. The twilight, slowly receding with each passing minute, seemed gray. The hospital room was silent. Julianne stared at the ceiling and realized that although the painful, torturous dream was behind her, but the true nightmare met her only upon awakening, because she suddenly, for the first time in all these years, experienced the heart-wrenching pain of abandoning her first child. She suddenly realized that he, her son, was already a grown-up now, a grown-up man. And how did his fate turn out? Did he find a loving family for him, or did he grow up in an orphanage? Julianne cried. She suddenly realized that no matter what she thought, felt, or did now, she could never know what was wrong with him. She could never find him. "Daddy, when are we going home?" Jacob asked. After visiting their neighbor in the hospital, they had walked around town for a while, had eaten burgers for lunch, and were now heading back to the apartment. "We're going there now," Alexander replied. "That's not what I mean. I mean the real house. I want to go to my mom's. I think it will be soon." "And exactly?" "Really soon, son. You sound like her lawyer." Jacob sighed and mocked Jared. "Soon it'll all work out. We just need time." "Don't you like your school?" "No, it's fine," Jacob shrugged. "Just no friends." "Why not? You know how to be popular, don't you?" "What's the point? We'll be gone soon anyway. You need friends even for 5 minutes. So, look," they stopped. Alexander, putting his palms on his son's shoulders, looked him straight in the eyes. "I, too, hope that soon it will be over, and we can go home, and Mom will be with us, and we'll go to Rome for the vacations." "Absolutely. But unfortunately, we can't know how things will turn out in our lives. We can only plan and adjust. Do you understand? So let's keep our heads up. Do you think we have to do all this?" the boy asked as they continued on their way. "We had to go to this city to live in a cheap apartment. We could have been anywhere. Tokyo, for example. You know, the principle of hiding under the enemy's nose doesn't always work. Or Argentina. Austin," my father said sternly. "I chose this country because they can't reach us here. I hope. Their connections are not unlimited. Until we can be sure that they haven't lost their power yet, we'd better lay low. Tell me, is it stupid to wait out a tornado by locking yourself in the house? Do we have to face it by standing bravely in the middle of a field? No," Jacob sighed. "Okay, I hear you. We'll live a normal, quiet life. Dad, why are you working? We have plenty of money." "I don't work. I just have friends who need my services, and they don't want to take up my time for free. And besides," he smiled, "what else am I supposed to do all day long? Be bored and cook you a nice meal. So I sit at my computer and use my talents as an economist. Let's go home. See how it's going to rain? And I have a weak immune system." Jacob rolled his eyes. "I'm healthy as an ox, Dad." "I'm sure you are, but you better be careful." That evening, after putting his son to bed, Alexander stayed in the kitchen. He stared at the monitor of his laptop, but not for work, running a slideshow of photos. The man plunged into memories. To think. A year ago, he thought he was probably the happiest man in the world. He had a great job where he reached fantastic heights, a woman he loved and a son by her. And then his life, which seemed so stable, was destroyed. It was like the eruption of a dormant volcano, which seemed safe only for the time being. But he realized it too late. On the screen appeared a photo taken more than a quarter of a century ago. Alexander, then a boy, and his parents, smiling. The whole family stood on the seashore. It was the first time all three of them had seen it. Alexander had always thought his parents were the best in the world. They loved him with all their hearts, even though he was adopted. He found out when he was 5 years old, and somehow he immediately took it normally. He wasn't even hurt that he had once had a mother who had abandoned him. What did it matter when he now had a mommy he loved? Nancy moved abroad because her husband Arnold found a job there in Mexico. As a talented scientist, he was offered a place in a university. He was a teacher and at the same time conducted research activities. He was engaged in space. Alexander grew up, absorbed the culture of Mexico, but after graduating from high school went to the United States to enter Harvard. His family was wealthy enough to give their son such a head start in life. Alexander chose to specialize in finance, and after receiving his degree, he got a job in a large firm that was engaged in the transportation of various goods between America and Mexico. Career was not just going, it was flying uphill. The boss liked how Alexander cleverly finds ways to reduce taxation as he negotiates with the authorities, knocking out the best favorable conditions. There, at work, Alexander met Jessica. She was a very young secretary, who was accepted, in fact, thanks to the patronage of her uncle, was on the board of directors of the firm. They had an affair, got married, then a son was born. Jessica laughed, saying that in general, her family has its own traditions. But so be it. Let the son will be called a wonderful and foreign name Austin. She will get used to it. The family's happiness seemed cloudless. Alexander's parents moved closer to their son to see him and their grandson more often. The couple planned that by organizing themselves a passive income, they could retire early and settle in their house in Mexico, on the shore of the bay where, maybe to avoid boredom, open a small cafe for tourists. Alexander, although he lived abroad most of his life, but did not forget his roots and did everything to make his son, as he grew up, spoke fluently, not only in English and Spanish, but also knew Russian. The boy in general turned out to be capable of languages, and the couple thought that his future profession would be somehow connected with it. And then one day FBI agents burst into the office. It turned out that Alexander's boss had been laundering money and making illegal deals for years. And the threads from all this led to the mafia. Jessica was arrested on her fell on the greatest suspicion. Alexander remained at large and fought for 6 months to get his wife released. His and her parents had to leave for the time of all this big showdown under the Witness Protection Program. There was too great a chance that the family of Alexander and Jessica could be used to pressure them, but that was not all. One day, Alexander was contacted by a man who was a distant acquaintance of his, whom he, however, could trust 100%. And he said that it was about to get even hotter, and that it would be best for Alexander to disappear for a while. "Where to?" he said in a daze. "I have a child. I can't go galloping around the world with him." "It would be better if you did," said the man across from him, quite seriously. "Here's a list of countries," he handed him a sheet, "in which you can't show your nose at customs. There are other people. They'll quickly inform you that you've arrived." "Excellent. You've just crossed off half the planet." "You're exaggerating. You're left with a pretty wide choice. Find a place where you can lay low. Keep a low profile. Let your son go to school. Just go about your normal life. And when things get better, you'll be notified. I'll keep you informed of everything that happens, believe me." Alexander took time to think. Just a couple of days. Then, through the same man, he conveyed his decision to Jessica. "I love you," she said on a date with her husband. "Everything is going to be okay, and we love you, Mommy." Jacob knew he had to be a serious little man, but still sniffed his nose at these last minutes they were spending together. For a while, father and son had been mixing up the tracks. They had traveled to France, Germany, Turkey, Italy, and finally ended up here, in a small town. And now they could just live here, waiting for it all to be over, so they could return to what was so priceless to them, to their family. Over the next week, after Alexander and Jacob had visited Julianne in the hospital, they visited her a few more times. They stopped by to ask about her health, to give her something good to eat or things she needed. Julianne had been embarrassed at first. She wasn't used to getting help from strangers in her whole life. But now, it turned out to be very nice to be genuinely cared for. They talked a little more. Alexander and Jacob didn't talk much, though, and listened more. Julianne suddenly needed listeners. She talked about how she loved Anna, how she had raised her. She remembered her husband. One day, as Alexander and his son were leaving the hospital, the head doctor called out to them. "Can you spare 5 minutes?" he asked. He wanted to know how things were going with the fact that Juliana Vasilyevna would soon be discharged. And one has to go somewhere to live, of course. And where? The thing was that the chief physician was already aware of the patient's situation and accidentally witnessed her story. "You see, although she is registered in this apartment," said the head doctor, "but in fact her son-in-law won't let her live there. It's kind of none of my business," he coughed. "But somehow it's awkward to discharge a person on the street. You, as I think, have already established communication with her. Get the phone numbers of some people she knows. Maybe someone will agree to take her in for a while." "Okay," Alexander replied briefly, and he and his son left. "Dad, where are you going?" Jacob asked. They had just gotten home and they were about to have dinner, but his father was putting on his shoes in the hallway. "You make the tea and slice the bread," he said. "I'll go and see if I can talk to Julianne's brother-in-law. He's an idiot." "Don't say that. I'm sorry. But just, do you think he'd want her to live with him? I think it's too cruel. He's gonna hurt her." "Dad, that's not fair. But this woman has to go somewhere from the hospital." "We can't put her in our house," Alexander snorted, but he didn't go out the door, as if he was thinking. "But we could rent her an apartment. Just for the first time. We can afford it, I know." Alexander sighed. His son was certainly offering a reasonable solution, except that he didn't think it was worth getting so deep into the whole thing. After all, this Juliana herself had thought of selling her only home for the sake of her daughter's husband, whom they knew only a little. And yet he also realized that since they had started to help, and in theory, they could have stopped at the moment when they called an ambulance for her, then it turns out that now it was necessary to do something further. "Okay, that's what we'll do. But we're not babysitting her," he added, walking back into the kitchen. "You know, son, there are some people who are just waiting for others to solve all their problems for them. And it's important to stop them before they get on your neck." Julianne was shocked when her new acquaintances told her their plan. "You're going to rent an apartment for me," the woman gasped. "But no, it's too much." "You can't go to the street," Alexander said. "And then I offer not so much. You are a young woman and you can go to work in general. You can organize your life. I'm just offering you a small start in a difficult period. Hard times happen to everyone. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I'll be dropping by your ex-brother-in-law's house today to pick up your things. And if there's anything you need, please tell me and I'll get it for you." "Thank you." Tears came to Julianne's eyes. She couldn't believe she'd met such a nice man after all she'd been through. "Well, that's great. So you'll be discharged tomorrow and right into a new home." "I don't know how to thank you." "Just start living," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "Oh, friend." Lucy was almost bumped into in the corridor by her friend and colleague Veronica. Veronica was also a nurse, but as they say, she'd been working here for 3 years. "What a day today." Veronica waved both palms of her hands. "I've been driven around like a donkey on a farm. Can you imagine what the gastritics are doing? Somebody gave them some smoked sausage. Well, they treated themselves. And now we have to clean up the mess. Hey, it's good that my shift ends soon. At least I'll get some sleep." "I've just started," Lucy sighed. "Let's have a cup of coffee, huh?" Veronica winked at her. Lucy never refused a cup of the aromatic drink, which, by the way, her friend often had something tasty to go with it. Having settled down on the sofa, the friends began to talk about their own. "So, do you like him?" Veronica asked, chewing a chocolate-covered nut bar with zeal. "Who?" "Alexander. Who else?" "No. You're a terrible liar." Lucy sighed and took the candy bar. In general, she tried to eat less sweets, but if it was not cats but saber-toothed tigers scratching at her soul, then perhaps she could. She realized that it was just a coincidence. Such things happen in life. However, lately she crossed paths with Alexander every time he came to the hospital. They even exchanged a few words. Although, of course, one had to be a naive fool to believe that it could mean something. I hardly know him. He's only been here a few times. You know, if he's your destiny... Oh, stop it. Lucy almost jumped at those words and took a sip, not paying attention to the fact that it was still hot. If he is your destiny, Veronica continued stubbornly, you'll meet him again, when you're not looking forward to it at all. You want me to tell your fortune? What? Wait, you're a medical doctor. What kind of fortune-telling? The usual tarot cards. Look what a nice deck I found with kittens on it. Veronica's already fanning the cards. Pull one out. I won't. Take it, I said. Lucy complied with a sigh. What a stupid thing to do. She watched Veronica add 4 more cards to hers, lay them out with their shirts facing up, and then flip them over. Oh. Okay, let's do this later. Better. What is it? Lucy instantly thought that her friend had somehow lost her enthusiasm for fortune-telling. What did you see? Nothing. You can't lie either, by the way. Veronica hesitated, but then she couldn't stand it. I saw that there is a connection between you two, and that you will play a huge role in his life. But also, anyway, this Alexander, he has a dark past. And also, Veronica lowered her voice, death walks around him. What do you want? Steve asked, when the door, which had been knocking and ringing insistently for an hour, was again occupied by a neighbor. Your mother-in-law's things, give them back. Alexander answered with a polite smile. There are no her things here, and it seems to me that this woman, having lived with you here so long, what I had I took to the trash, Steve grinned. What do you care about her anyway? Are you going to marry an old woman, you lunatic? Or is she your mommy? Alexander was generally a peaceful man. He just realized that he was unlucky to meet a man who was used to interacting with the world around him, testing it by force. And if he found something weaker, he began to beat, suppress, dirty profiteering. Alexander had a friend in the FBI profiler, but even without his specific talent, it was possible to understand that Steve was very happy that everything worked out so well in his life, and that he was not particularly grieving for his wife. Alexander very much disliked such low, mean people. Get out of here. Steve grinned wryly. And you'd better keep an eye on the kid. Times are turbulent now. There's no telling what. Steve didn't have time to finish. Alexander didn't like mean people of that type, but he could ignore them, but only as long as they didn't cross certain boundaries. And now that boundary had been crossed, in the next few moments several things happened at once. First, Steve somehow found himself inside his apartment and facing the floor. Second, his neighbor hovered over him, painfully clasping his arm and hissing in his ear. His voice was quiet, calm, but oozed like venom with menace. If you so much as lay a finger on my son or think of hurting him, if you even look at me once and think ill of me, I'll know you think you're tough. No, you're not tough. You think you can threaten me? What are you gonna do if trouble comes to you personally? Believe me, I wouldn't want to do that. But I can if the need arises. And after you mentioned my son, consider it a necessity. Steve was shocked. Panting from the awkward position and the burning pain in his joints, he nodded. I got it, man. I got it. That's good. You know, if I want to, I can get you in a lot of trouble. Just give me a reason to. I got it. I got it. I got it. I got it. Let me go. I'll pack my mother-in-law's things. That's it. That's it. That's it. Alexander let him go and waited. After about 10 minutes of awkward fuss, Steve handed him a bag with things. Here, crystal vases, also hers. One of them broke off a little at the edges. I didn't do it by accident. Anyway, it's all here, really. I believe it. Alexander grinned and slapped Steve's cheek with the palm of his hand. Good boy. Now don't get on my nerves anymore, and everything will be fine. The next day, Alexander picked Julianne up from the hospital and took her to her new apartment. It was an apartment with a good repair, very decent and clean, which had everything necessary for a comfortable stay. The kitchen even had all sorts of unpacked new dishes. The refrigerator was full of food, including delicacies. Thank you. Julianne tearfully thanked Alexander and still made him feel embarrassed. But that was not all. He said that he would pay for her observation in a private clinic, which is simply necessary for a person who has such health problems. It will allow to exclude recurrences in the future. Dad, did you get an apartment for us? Jake asked when they got outside. No. Alexander had just found one apartment, and then he'd asked the realtor who'd shown it if she had any other good options. And then he'd told her what he wanted, and it so happened that 2 apartments were found literally in 2 neighboring houses. They were located in a new apartment complex and a couple of streets away from Julianne's old place of residence. It was just a coincidence. Alexander remembered the advice of his friend, the one who had advised him to run away, that it was better not to stay in the same apartment for more than 2 or 3 months. Well, 4 months at the most. He didn't question why that was so. He just took the advice, and it was just about time to move. A coincidence came out. In his conversations with Julianne, naturally, it was difficult and altogether impossible for Alexander to ignore his life. And since he couldn't tell her 1/100th of the truth, he had to get out of it. So, he told her that the boy's mother was just so busy that she couldn't go with them, and he decided to go back to his ancestral homeland for a while, to experience, so to speak, the places where his own distant childhood had once passed. Jacob was smart enough not to say too much, and everything seemed normal. Now they were sitting in the kitchen drinking tea. Juliana was remembering how well they'd lived in the village and talking frankly about how she hadn't been able to get along in the city, how she was drawn back. It was not the first time that this strange piece of jewelry for a man had attracted her attention. But now, it was as if something clicked in her head. Very interesting ring, Julianne murmured. It wasn't a ring, Jacob said. Dad had remade it from a pendant, a memory of the family. Julianne froze. And then, leaning forward, she stared at the ring. And how old are you, I beg your pardon? She asked. Alexander answered, but not his real age, and added 2 years. It was easy because his neighbor couldn't look in his passport. It was a woman's pendant. Jacob jumped back into the conversation, showing his father that he wasn't so smart. From his mother, the boy paused, catching his father's angry look. From his mother, Julianne whispered, staring down at her teacup again. She thought maybe going mad. No, the past, that terrible past, had no place in her life. That was a long time ago. Just a coincidence. Not many pendants looked like the same jewelry that was tossed to her that day as a handout, as a payment for her silence, especially since Alexander didn't mention that he was adopted. How else could? Julianne looked at the man carefully. He was handsome. And that man, the one on the boat, was handsome too. He had green eyes and blonde hair too. Julianne swallowed hard. A new memory came back of the nurse in the maternity ward holding out the baby to her, but she shoved it away with her hands. She was disgusted to touch this creature she had been forced to nourish with her own life force for an unbearable 9 months, and for some reason she remembered that the baby had a birthmark on his neck, exactly on his left collarbone, like a tiny star. Julianne's gaze fell from the face of the man opposite to the open collar of his shirt, and she saw the birthmark there. Coincidence? Just a coincidence. No, it couldn't be a coincidence anymore. Julianne's hands trembled and the cup fell, shattered. Are you ill? Alexander looked at her anxiously. Julianne, You." The woman found it hard to breathe. It was as if a flaming torch had been placed near her heart. She struggled to say something. She didn't know what she wanted to say. "Jacob, call an ambulance." Julianne's eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness. Then, as if through a veil, she realized she was being carried on a stretcher, carried in a car, put in a hospital bed, and fell again. Alexander was the first person she saw when she woke up. Juliana was ready to swear that now she was close to death for the second time. The first time he saved her. The second time she was almost dragged over the edge by memories. She weakly reached out to him and he smiled awkwardly but reassuringly touched her fingers. Squeezed them gently. "Don't worry. The doctors say a second attack was 50% expected, but you're doing great. There's something I need to tell you. You need to rest." "No." Julianne's voice was as stubborn as ever. "All right." Alexander nodded. "Let's invite Jacob in now. He's in the hallway. We'll talk for a bit and then rest." "No," Julianne said in a colorless voice. "Let him. There he will be for now. It's not for children's ears." Alexander raised an eyebrow in surprise, but agreed. He assumed the conversation would be about Julianne's daughter or her son-in-law. In general, it would be heavy. Well, if the woman wanted it that way, why not? Alexander looked out into the hallway and asked his son, who was sitting playing on his phone, not to disturb them yet. "Please," Jacob said. "I'm just about to start the hard levels. Are we going to eat pizza later?" "Sure," his father told him and went back to the room. If Julianne had thought about this conversation beforehand, she wouldn't have been able to figure out how to tell him. But now, in a special state of mind, in the power of the moment, she spoke. She did not want to shock Alexander by making him feel sorry for her. She didn't even know yet. She couldn't be 100% sure that she was right. But she knew that it was time to tell the whole truth. They were not alone in the room, but the bed was in the corner. The next one was empty. That is, other patients were lying farther away. And since Julianne spoke quietly, it was really a private conversation, or rather a one-on-one story. Alexander listened to her attentively. At first his face expressed nothing. Then it seemed to her that he wanted to stop her. But again he said nothing. He was silent, he listened. Julianne's story ended where their acquaintance began with her losing her daughter. "I know it was a long time ago," she added, "maybe. It's all just a coincidence, but I don't know. And also, I want to believe. That's not true." I can feel the desperate hope in her tone now. "I found you, son." She reached out to him again, but he withdrew his hand. Then he stood up and took a step back. Alexander wasn't shocked. Nor was he horrified. No, all those words would be too soft and light to describe his current state. "Alexander," Julianne called out, realizing that he was about to leave. "That's not true," he said sharply as he spat it out. And he left the room. Julianne felt as if she'd been hit. It was very hard for her. And she was also very tired. She felt as if this conversation had drained her of the strength that the doctors had brought back to her. The nurse entered the room just in time. The patient, sobbing and whispering something, lost consciousness. Again, doctors fussed, but Alexander did not recognize it because he, together with his son, hurriedly left the hospital. "Dad, what are you doing?" Jacob asked him when they got to the pizza place as planned. "What were you and Julianne talking about?" "It's okay," Alexander replied. He had already gotten himself under control. He understood whatever was going on with him, but he had to hold on for the sake of his son, who had already been through too much for a child lately. It was just Julianne talking about how life used to be. "Sad?" Jacob asked, tearing off the edges of the pizza, not liking the dry crust. "Very," Alexander nodded. He knew it wasn't a good idea to call his parents. Theoretically, it shouldn't endanger them too much. If it did, there was no way Alexander would have done it. But in principle, he was advised to limit his contacts with all his former acquaintances as much as possible. However, he felt that now was the time when he needed that contact. "Hi, Mom," he said. First they talked, of course, about the most important things, how his family was doing, his son, what small but important news they had. Mom shared that under the Witness Protection Program they were living in some backwoods Texas town. But it was very nice and everyone was getting ready to celebrate Halloween. And they were getting ready to celebrate Halloween. And they were getting ready too. They were making their own recipe for pumpkin and cranberry-filled candy and would give it to the kids who would be knocking on the door for the holiday. And then Alexander started talking about why he had called. He wanted to talk about his biological mother, his real mother, the woman who brought him up, giving him all the love and care she was capable of, and even a little more, was surprised by such a question. But she told him everything she knew. Alexander listened to her attentively. "They say it will soon be over and you can come back," Mom said. "Father is on a fishing trip. He misses you very much." "I miss you too," Alexander said. "Jacob is sleeping. I will wake him up now." He did so, and Jacob was thrilled that he could talk to his favorite grandmother. Alexander pondered for a long time. He just couldn't believe that there were such coincidences in the world. But what Julianne had told him made him even worse. He felt sick when he remembered her story. So this was what his father was like, disgusting. But what made it worse was that he remembered something. He remembered something from the recent past. And it was related to Juliana's story, and more precisely to the name of the yacht she had been on, to its owner, because Alexander remembered the name of the yacht of the man he had met before he was forced to flee. It was not his friend who had helped him in everything, but a very different person, very bad. The next day, Alexander reappeared in Julianne's room. But before she could say a word, he spoke. "We need a genetic test. It will allow me, and you to know the truth." Julianne nodded. She was in agreement, now that her life, shattered by the loss of her only daughter, was beginning to take shape again. She realized that this was really the only way to find out, and without conspiring, they didn't bring it up again for the next few days. Alexander and Jacob visited Julianne. And then, on one of those days, Alexander came in with papers in hand. He sat down at Julianne's bedside. He was pale. "The test results showed that you are my mother," he said. And then, reaching out, he touched her hand, but he wasn't looking at her. "You know, they told me I was adopted very early on, and it was always okay for me. I just took it for granted, as part of the natural order of things in the world. I never thought about wanting to find out who my real parents were. I didn't want to find my birth mother and find out why she gave me up. And now, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." "I don't know what to do either," Julianne replied quietly. "But Alexander shuddered faintly and they met gazes. "Since it's all true, then, is there something you want to say?" Julianne seemed to read his mind. "Later. You can't worry now, but I'll worry if I don't know. You have something important to tell me, don't you?" Alexander sighed. "Perhaps if I say it, it's for the best. The thing is, some time ago, under certain circumstances, I met a man, and Anyway, we were forced to spend some time together." Alexander felt strange, as if he had been swept up by a mighty river or a tornado and was being carried somewhere. This man, his name was Sebastian. "Did that name?" Julianne gasped. Yes, she knew that name. "Sebastian Rodrigo," she finished, saying the last name. She remembered him. She remembered the name of the yacht owner in whose terrible power she had then found herself. "He threatened my wife. It just so happened that she got involved in affairs, finances that had criminal origins. We met one-on-one. Alexander was having a hard time with all of this. He set up a meeting on his yacht. He wanted me to agree to get my wife to destroy some of his business documents. But I didn't come to the meeting alone. The FBI sent me. They wanted to capture him, and I was to play bait. They wanted me to get him to talk. He did. He admitted he'd been in business with the mob for decades. He said his patrons wouldn't let him get arrested. And then his guards got suspicious. And he took the boat out of the harbor and into the open sea. He was pursued. He panicked and threw himself overboard. He expected to be picked up by a boat with his men on it. But there was a shark. They said it's a rare white shark. It attacked him. They didn't get to him in time to pick him up. He wasn't rescued in time. He wasn't rescued in time. He was gone. Julianne clenched her eyes shut, tears streaming from under her closed eyelids. How many years she had thought about how much she hated the man who had ruined her life. How she had cursed him. And now she found out he was dead. Shouldn't she be relieved, happy? He had died at sea. At sea, her womanhood had once been destroyed, trampled upon, dishonored. But why is there no triumphant joy or relief now? Why does she just not care? It's so strange. It turns out it was my father and I. Alexander spoke in a colorless voice. I saw him attacked by a shark, and I rarely thought about what my father might have been. It's strange that I didn't think about my mother. But I did think about my father. And now I know. What am I supposed to do with all this knowledge? And Jacob, Julianne asked quietly. Does he know? No. Alexander's gaze was suddenly cold and steely. And he won't find out. You can't tell him that. He knows his father is adopted. But that knowledge is enough for him. Julianne nodded. She didn't want to argue with her newfound son. A son. To think she had lost a daughter, and then found the child she had cut out of her heart so many years ago. And they met, thinking they were strangers to each other. Her son turned out to be so good. He came to her aid without knowing her at all. And also, even though he said the past didn't mean anything to him, but why are you wearing that ring? Why? Julianne asked. I thought you said that the past didn't matter to you, because it always reminds me that I've been lucky in life. Reminds me that my parents chose me. It keeps me going when the going gets tough. Reminds me that luck is real. Because I found my real family when I was abandoned by the person I love most, my mom. Julianne realized that Alexander was telling the truth, and how bitter it was in every word. It was like this. She had disowned her son, denied all rights to him back then. But did the fact that they met now, after so many years, when she was all alone, mean nothing? Julianne just refused to believe it. But the worst thing she feared had not happened when she learned the whole truth. Alexander had not turned away from her at the same moment, which meant she could hope. Excuse me, Lucy's in the room. We're running out of visiting hours. Yes, of course, Alexander said, and after saying goodbye to Julianne, he left the room. Jacob was waiting for him quietly in the hallway, as before. What are you two talking about? Okay, boring, grown-up talk. Don't get your head in the game. But they stayed a little longer at the hospital, still needed to talk to the doctor about Juliana's condition, to find out what medication was needed and what recommendations there were about further treatment. Lucy appeared so suddenly from the corner of the hospital corridor, carrying in both hands a cup of coffee for herself and Veronica, that Alexander, who was walking in the opposite direction, almost knocked her down. The fall was avoided. She managed to get her hands behind her back, thus catching her in an embrace and supporting her. But the coffee spilled, on him and on her. It's hot, Lucy squeaked. I'm sorry, stammered Alexander. Really, I'm sorry. Did you burn yourself? No, it's all right, smiled girl. Now you just need a change of clothes. Alexander loosened the casual embrace and Lucy sighed. She definitely liked his touch. Just the day before she had been thinking about this man, so caring, who cared about her neighbor, and then she met him. It's really my fault. It's nothing, Lucy sighed. How's Julianne? She's good. Do you know a good caregiver? Oh, wow, what? I asked the attending physician. He recommended looking through the appropriate agencies. Alexander explained. And you? It's just that patients speak very well of you, and I thought I could rely on your opinion. Do you need a nurse? Maybe. I need someone who can visit Julianne occasionally. See how she's getting on and help out if necessary. Well, I know. I have a couple of friends who are part-time caregivers, Lucy replied. They are quite decent women and qualified professionals. I could talk to them. I'd be very grateful. Let me give you my number. Finally, father and son left the hospital. It was raining outside. It felt like a real cold fall was approaching. Alexander's phone rang as soon as he and his son crossed the threshold of the apartment. Jessica? Alexander was shocked to hear that his wife was calling him because they had talked hardly 10 times since he and his son had had to leave, and he had usually been warned in advance that they would be able to talk by a friend. Mommy? Jacob cheered and immediately tugged at his father's hand. Gimme. It's over. What Jessica was saying was unbelievable to hear. Here, he handed the phone to his son, and then the second phone rang. Everything Alexander carried too many smartphones with him at all times, in order to always be in touch if one of them broke. It was just a habit. The second caller turned out to be the very man who had done a lot to keep his family safe. Is it true? Alexander wouldn't let him say a word at first. Can we go back? Yes, on the next flight. Mom, we're going home, Jacob cried with joy. Mommy, I love you. Then the day went by a little like a dream. Alexander received a phone call from his parents to congratulate him and to clarify and assure him that it was safe to return. He had to pack his things. We have a test tomorrow, Jacob suddenly remembered. You're skipping it, Alexander grinned. What are we going to tell them? I'm sorry, son, but we're going to have to be impolite people because we don't have time. The plane. We have a plane ticket in 6 hours. Hey, what are you doing with that flower pot? Well, it's a souvenir for Grandma. I'm afraid it won't work. Alexander grinned, returning the plant to the windowsill. First of all, it belongs to the man from whom we rent an apartment. Secondly, customs won't let. Why not? You see, without special permits, all kinds of plants, and especially pots with them, cannot be transported. There may be larvae of insect pests. Well, okay. I think Grandmother is happy enough that her grandson has returned to her. On the way to the airport, Alexander and Jacob stopped by the hospital. Of course, it wasn't the best way to say goodbye, but Lucy, they're looking for you. Veronica looked into the restroom with round eyes. Who? The girl didn't understand. She had just laid down to rest for a minute. Alexander. Oh, Lucy fussed, began to adjust her robe, rushed to look for a cosmetic bag. And in about 5 minutes she appeared in the corridor. Lucy, I want to ask you a favor, Alexander addressed her. I'm sorry that it all comes out in a hurry, but we are in a hurry. We're going home, Jacob said impatiently. The girl looked at Alexander and his son confused. She did not understand anything. Alexander said that unfortunately he had no acquaintances here. Therefore, she was his only hope. He said they were going home to his wife, Jacob's mom, and all his friends. He also said that he needed special help. Lucy listened to him carefully. Alexander asked him to take care of Julianne. No, it wasn't something very burdensome, but it was necessary to look after Juliana Vassilievna for some time, namely to help her return home from the hospital. She was to be discharged in 3 days. and also to make sure that an au pair could be hired from the agency, and if her health required it, a nurse. Alexander said that, in principle, he considered Juliana Vasilievna to be quite an independent person. She could certainly take care of herself. But after the tragedy and illness she had suffered, of course it would be better not to be alone for some time. Here, for expenses and payment for your help. With these words, he handed Lucy an envelope. I don't need it. The girl's cheeks flushed. I'll help you anyway. I am very grateful to you, and I believe it, Alexander smiled. And yet, also, please give her this. He held out a second envelope, signed, to Juliana from Alexander. And you, won't you go in to see her? Lucy couldn't understand what this was about, but somehow she felt that something had happened between Alexander and Julianne that had changed their relationship. No, Alexander answered. He had made a decision. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't want to come in and talk about nothing, pretend that everything was normal. And he didn't want, after telling the truth that he was flying to his family, to face the scene. He understood he felt that Julianne has hopes for him. She believes they can have a future together, like a son and a mother. Except that was impossible for him. He started helping this woman without knowing that she was his mother. And now he continues to do what he would have done if Julianne had remained just a neighbor to him. And what he might have said to her before they parted, he outlined in a letter. What is it? Julianne asked as Lucy handed her the letter. From Alexander. Why didn't he himself? She was silent as she opened the letter. He talked about how knowing that she was his mother didn't change anything for him. He admitted that he wanted to remain for her, a neighbor or random person who was happy to help. But he doesn't want to be her son. He has a mom. His real and only mom. He has a family. He goes back to them. And he leaves the funds and asks the only person he knows here to help him take care of Julianne a little. And then, well, she should just move on with her life. The envelope also contained cash, and at the very end of the letter was a note. Alexander left his phone number there. He asked not to call him for nothing, but if it would be really necessary. For example, when Juliana would choose a place where she would like to buy an apartment or a house in the village, if she decided to return there, then let her contact him, and he would support her financially. But that's it. That's it. The woman's hands fell on the blanket. She looked in front of her, and as if she saw nothing. Julianne, Lucy spoke to her quietly. Are you sick again? No, the woman replied. I'm fine. It's just the way life is. She looked up at Lucy. So you'll help me when I'm discharged? The nurse nodded. That's good. Lucy sighed. I'm going to take a nap now. Wake me up, honey, for dinner. And just before she fell asleep, Juliana thought that it seemed that she was wrong. It was as if she had a son. And no, she was still all alone. She was still all alone. Too, he didn't leave. Even here, he promised to help. But this, no money will not replace what she, in some moments, dared to hope for. Lucy walked down the hospital corridor in thoughtfulness. This was it. Her fairy tale romance was over before it began. Oh, there you are. Her friend Veronica bumped into her. So how's it going? Yes, Lucy nodded. He flew home. Overseas somewhere. He said he was married, by the way. You know, Vera, she smiled at her friend. Your fortune telling was wrong. I don't play any big role in his life. And he seems to have everything settled in his life, which was not good before. It's just felt. I could read it in his eyes. But the fact that I was disappointed, it's even better. Sometimes it's good to believe in fairy tales and then come back to earth, right? Invigorating, you know. And Lucy went on with her work for the day. It was a long flight. Jacob looked at his watch every now and then. wondering when they would arrive. Alexander was asleep. It was only when he was on the plane that he suddenly realized how tired he was, and now he needed one rest more than anything else. And then, when the plane finally landed, they walked in and out of the airport. They were greeted by Alexander and Jessica's birth parents. His wife threw herself around Alexander's neck and then hugged her son tightly and tightly. There was the very acquaintance who helped Alexander in his movements around the world, as well as special agents of the FBI who were assigned to tell Alexander all the details of how exactly this complex case was completed, after the closure of which he finally got the opportunity to return. It seemed that this day would never end, but it did come to an end. Alexander and Jacob were standing on the coast in Florida. The sun was dipping into the ocean. "What are we going to do now?" Jessica asked him. She stood with her husband and son so that her feet were ankle-deep in the surf. "What we wanted to do. I think it's time to stop. And even if we didn't get as rich as we wanted, we can do it. So I guess it's time to move to Mexico. I think my parents will help us open a little restaurant." Jessica sighed. "What happened while I was away? Tell me." "I'll tell you everything for sure," said Alexander. He looked at the sea and thought about the woman who stayed far away. Once she left him refused, and although they met, but nothing connected them, and Alexander also realized that something had lost its former value for him. He took the ring off his finger. "Dad, what are you doing?" Jacob gasped. "Just getting rid of the past, son," Alexander said, and launched the ring far out into the ocean, where it hit the water and then plunged downward, disappearing forever. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.